The morning sun shone brightly over Buckingham Palace, its golden rays bouncing off the grand gates. Crowds of tourists gathered outside, eager to take pictures and see the famous royal guards, standing tall and motionless in their red coats and black bearskin hats. Among them was Sergeant Daniel Okafor, a proud and disciplined black royal guardsman. He had served for years, standing in this very spot, keeping watch over the palace with unwavering focus. The guards were known for their stillness, their ability to remain serious no matter what happened around them. It was a symbol of strength, discipline, and honor. Daniel loved his job. He wasn't just a guard. He was a protector, a symbol of tradition and loyalty. Every day, tourists took photos, waved their hands in front of his face, and sometimes even tried to make him laugh. But he never reacted. His training had taught him to remain calm, to ignore distractions. Today seemed like any other day. At first, families snapped selfies, children pointed excitedly at the guards, and groups of visitors admired the beauty of the palace. Daniel kept his gaze straight ahead, his hands resting firmly on his ceremonial rifle. Then, a loud voice broke through the crowd. "Hey, look at this one. Do they let just anyone in these days?" The voice belonged to a tourist, a man with a smug look on his face. His name was Richard Coleman, an American visiting London. He had a camera in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. From the way he carried himself, it was clear he enjoyed attention. At first, Daniel ignored him, just like he ignored everyone else. But Richard wasn't just taking photos. He was talking. Too much. "I thought the royal guards were supposed to be British," he said loudly, turning to the people around him. "Didn't know they started hiring from just anywhere." Some of the other tourists shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances but saying nothing. The crowd had been cheerful before, but now there was tension in the air. Daniel remained still. He had heard worse. But Richard wasn't done. He smirked and stepped closer. "Come on, mate," he taunted. "You don't belong here. Say something, will you?" Silence. Daniel had dealt with people like this before. He knew better than to react. His training told him to stand firm, to be the wall that no insult could break. Still, he could feel the stares of the crowd. Some looked worried. Others pulled out their phones, sensing something might happen. Richard laughed, thinking he was being clever, but he had no idea what was coming next. Because this time, Sergeant Daniel Okafor was not going to let him cross the line. Richard stepped closer, his face twisted into a grin as he continued his mockery. He waved his hand in front of Daniel's face, hoping to get a reaction. But the guardsman stood perfectly still, not even blinking, his gaze fixed forward, as if Richard didn't exist. This only seemed to make Richard more determined to get a response. "Hey, you hear me?" Richard shouted again, his voice louder now. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "What's a guy like you even doing here? Do they really let anyone be part of the Royal Guard these days?" The words stung, but Daniel didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his years of service. People often didn't understand the discipline required to be a Royal Guard. They thought it was easy to stand still for hours, facing the constant interruptions of tourists and curious passersby. They didn't understand the patience, the mental strength it took to stay quiet and firm, no matter what was said. But today was different. Richard's words weren't just a joke or a harmless comment. They were filled with something darker, disrespect. Richard was testing the boundaries, pushing further, thinking he could get away with it because of his privilege. As Richard stepped even closer, Daniel could hear his next words, and this time, they were meant to hurt. "Can't believe they've got people like you doing this job," Richard said loudly. "You should be doing something more normal. You know, like working somewhere else." The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Some people exchanged glances, while others simply shook their heads, sensing that something was wrong. The joyful atmosphere of the morning seemed to fade as the tension grew. Richard wasn't backing down. He looked around, trying to get the attention of the others, as if he wanted to show off. "Why don't you talk back? You don't seem like you're even from here. You sure you belong in this uniform?" The words cut deeper than Richard could have imagined, but Daniel still didn't react. His training, the lessons of his military career, told him to stay composed. A royal guardsman didn't answer to taunts, didn't respond to insults. They stood tall, no matter what. They represented more than just themselves. They represented an entire legacy, an institution that had lasted for centuries. Richard, however, wasn't interested in respecting any of that. He wanted a fight. He wanted attention. And when he saw that Daniel wasn't moving, he took another step forward, his face full of arrogance. "Come on, do something. Or are you too scared to say anything?" Richard's words echoed in the silence that had fallen over the crowd. People started to murmur. Some even raised their phones, likely ready to record whatever happened next. Daniel could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but he didn't move an inch. He had never needed to explain himself. But today, something inside him shifted. The line had been crossed, and Richard was about to find out the cost of his words. Without a single word, Daniel moved. And Richard was going to see something he'd never expected. Richard stood just inches from Daniel now, his voice filled with arrogance. He had pushed and pushed, sure that he was in control of the situation. He expected the royal guardsman to stay still, to remain silent as always. After all, that's what people thought the job required, being a statue, unshaken by anything. But today was different. Daniel's eyes, usually fixed on the horizon, slowly shifted down to meet Richard's. The change was subtle, but it was enough to make Richard stop in his tracks. For a moment, there was a tension in the air that wasn't there before. The smile that had once stretched across Richard's face began to fade, replaced by confusion. Still, Richard wasn't done. He took another step forward, his smugness growing. "I guess you really are just a decoration, huh? Like one of those silly little statues they put in front of palaces, except you're alive. Can't even talk," he sneered. For the first time that day, Daniel's voice broke the silence. "Step back," he said calmly, but with a tone of authority. "This is your last warning." But Richard, still too confident, didn't listen. He leaned even closer, staring Daniel in the eye, as if daring him to do something. The crowd was watching now, some people stepping back, sensing that the situation was about to change. Richard raised his hand, as if to wave it in front of Daniel's face again. But this time, he didn't get the chance. In one swift motion, Daniel raised his boot and slammed it down with a force that could be heard throughout the crowd. The sound of his foot striking the cobblestone echoed in the sudden quiet. Daniel's eyes never left Richard's, but the way he stood, firm and unyielding, spoke volumes. The message was clear. Enough was enough. "Don't touch me." Daniel's voice was firm, but not loud. There was no need for shouting. His presence alone commanded respect. Richard hesitated, finally realizing that he had pushed the situation too far. He looked around at the stunned crowd, but no one spoke up. It was as though time had frozen for a brief moment. Richard's confidence wavered. His chest puffed out less, and his sneer faded into an awkward smile, unsure of what to do next. "Do you what?" Richard stammered, his voice shaky now. "You can't seriously be upset about a little joke. It's not like I said anything bad." But Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He didn't have to explain himself. The way he stood, unflinching, was enough to tell Richard that he had made a mistake. The crowd had fallen completely silent, and for a few moments, all that could be heard was the distant hum of the city. Daniel knew this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up to disrespect, about showing that no one should be allowed to speak like that to another person, no matter their job or position. Richard took a step back, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The power in the situation had completely shifted. Daniel, the man he had mocked just moments before, was now the one in control. But Richard still didn't understand. He still didn't realize how much trouble he had gotten himself into. Richard took a hesitant step back, still trying to process what had just happened. His smug expression had completely disappeared, replaced by a mixture of confusion and discomfort. He was no longer the one in control of the situation. Daniel had taken charge without even raising his voice, and now the crowd watched in silence, waiting for what would happen next. Richard glanced around at the people around him. They were all staring at him, some with raised eyebrows, others shaking their heads. No one was laughing anymore. The few who had been recording the moment on their phones were now focused on Daniel, and Richard could feel their eyes on him. He was no longer the center of attention. Feeling embarrassed, Richard shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He looked up at Daniel, but this time, his usual arrogance had melted away. He was no longer taunting the guard. Instead, he seemed unsure of what to say. Daniel stood tall, his posture straight, unwavering. His face remained calm, but there was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. It was as if he had just reminded Richard, and everyone around them, that disrespect would not be tolerated. For a moment, Richard tried to regain his confidence, but it wasn't working. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I didn't mean anything by it, he muttered, his voice lacking the sharpness it had held before. It was just a joke, all right. Daniel didn't move. His eyes were still fixed on Richard, steady and unblinking. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. It felt like the whole world had slowed down for a moment. Richard shifted his weight again, this time stepping back. He was no longer making jokes. He wasn't even trying to provoke Daniel anymore. His earlier bravado had completely disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that he had gone too far. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice as calm as before, but with a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. You don't get to disrespect me, or anyone, because you think you can, Daniel said, his words clear and direct. And you don't get to make jokes at someone's expense when they've done nothing to deserve it. Richard looked around, his face flushed with embarrassment. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and for the first time that day, he was no longer enjoying the attention. He was ashamed, and he knew it. He had expected to walk away from this with a funny story to tell, but instead, he found himself backpedaling, his pride quickly slipping away. Some of the tourists who had been standing nearby now gave Daniel small nods of approval, clearly impressed by his dignity and strength. Others whispered among themselves, clearly discussing what had just unfolded. It was as though the whole scene had transformed from a moment of tension into a lesson in respect, one that everyone could understand. Richard didn't say anything else. He stood there for a moment, processing the situation, and then, with a final glance at Daniel, he turned and started walking away. His steps were slow, heavy with embarrassment. The crowd parted slightly to let him pass, but no one made any effort to follow him or offer him any sympathy. Daniel, however, didn't look at him again. He had already returned to his position, standing tall and resolute, his gaze fixed forward once more. The event was over, but the message had been sent loud and clear. Daniel had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had shown that no one, no matter who they were or where they came from, was above respect. As Richard walked away, his face flushed bright red with embarrassment. The crowd began to murmur. The energy around Buckingham Palace had completely shifted. What had started as a lighthearted, almost playful scene had turned into something entirely different, a moment of confrontation that no one would forget quickly. Richard's footsteps were slower now, his movements awkward as he made his way through the crowd. He had been so sure of himself just moments before, but now, it was as if he was shrinking under the weight of the stares from the onlookers. He had misjudged the situation completely. Some of the tourists who had been snapping pictures of the guards just moments before now glanced at Richard with puzzled expressions, unsure of what had just happened. A few shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with how things had turned out. But no one said a word. The silence was heavy. Daniel, standing firm as always, didn't look back. His posture was perfect, his body language unshaken by the drama that had just unfolded. He remained as professional as ever, standing guard, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. It was as if he had merely performed his duty. No more, no less. But to the people around him, it was clear that something important had just occurred. Richard's attempts to make light of the situation had failed. He had thought that a joke, a few words of mockery, would be enough to entertain the crowd. Instead, he had been shown that some things should never be made light of, respect being one of them. As Richard passed through the crowd, some people turned their attention back to the guards, though the mood had changed. No one seemed as interested in taking photos now. The moment with Daniel had shifted the focus. Richard, once the loudest voice in the crowd, was now just another tourist, shrinking in the shadow of his own embarrassment. A few people quietly began to talk about what had happened. "Did you see that? The way he stood his ground." One person whispered, nodding toward Daniel. "That guy had no idea who he was messing with." Another person chimed in. "It's not every day you see someone put in their place like that." The crowd seemed to agree. Daniel had gained the respect of the onlookers, not with force, but with composure. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't lost his cool. He had simply stood firm, showing that his dignity and respect for others couldn't be shaken. And that had made all the difference. Richard, now far from the crowd, finally stopped near the gates, his face still red. He stood there for a few moments, his head hung low. He had hoped to leave the situation with a sense of triumph, but instead he was only left with regret. His words, meant to provoke, had only led to his own humiliation. Still unsure of what to do next, Richard began to leave the area. But the crowd's attention had already shifted back to Daniel. The royal guardsman had silently earned the admiration of everyone present, not by reacting aggressively, but by remaining unmoved by the disrespect that had been thrown his way. The tourists slowly began to take photos again, but now the focus wasn't just on the uniforms or the palace. They were also capturing the calm confidence of the man who had shown them all the true meaning of respect. Richard, meanwhile, had learned a lesson the hard way, that mockery and disrespect have consequences, and sometimes those consequences can be far more powerful than he could ever imagine. As Richard walked away from the crowd, still shaken by what had just happened, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace started to return to normal. But the calm didn't last long. The earlier tension in the air was replaced by a different kind of energy. People were whispering among themselves, some discussing the incident, while others were still staring at Daniel with admiration. Suddenly, a few figures in dark blue uniforms appeared through the crowd. 2 security officers, tall and professional, made their way toward Daniel. They had been stationed nearby, watching the situation unfold from a distance. They could tell something wasn't right. When they saw the interaction between Richard and the royal guardsman, they knew it was time to step in. The officers approached with purpose. Daniel, still standing tall and unmoving, didn't react to their presence. His focus was still forward, but his training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings. The guards had been watching him, sensing the moment was coming. Now it was their turn to intervene. One of the security officers, a woman with short, dark hair, spoke first. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Daniel nodded once, his face still expressionless. "Yes," he replied in a steady voice. "The situation has been dealt with." The second officer, a man with a thick build, glanced at Richard, who was now standing by the gates, trying to blend in with the crowd. He looked uncomfortable, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he glanced around nervously. The officers exchanged a brief look before turning their attention back to Daniel. "Would you like us to remove him from the area?" the female officer asked, glancing at Richard, who was clearly still flustered. It was obvious that he had made a scene, and now he seemed to be trying to disappear. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said simply. "Please escort him out." Without a word, the officers nodded and moved toward Richard, who was still trying to act as if nothing had happened. The officers walked right up to him, and he froze, looking up in surprise. It was as if he suddenly realized that things had taken a turn he hadn't expected. "Sir," the male officer said firmly, "you need to leave the area immediately. We cannot tolerate that kind of behavior here." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He had been so sure of himself before, but now he wasn't sure what to say. The situation had escalated beyond his control. The security officers weren't asking for his permission. They were removing him from the area for his own behavior. The embarrassment from earlier still hung heavy on him, and now he was facing the consequences. Reluctantly, Richard stepped away from the crowd and walked toward the exit, the officers flanking him on either side. The tourists who had been watching were now turning their attention back to the palace and its majestic gates, as though the whole incident had never happened. As Richard was escorted away, he muttered under his breath, "I didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke." But the officers were already ignoring him. They had done their job. He was leaving, and that was the end of it. The crowd, for the most part, had already returned to their sightseeing, but there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The lesson had been learned. Daniel, still standing his ground, watched the scene unfold. He didn't need to say another word. The situation had been handled, respectfully and without further conflict. The power of his composed reaction had made all the difference, and now Richard was facing the consequences of his actions, learning that disrespect would never go unnoticed. The incident was over, but its impact remained, and as the royal guard resumed their usual quiet duty, one thing was clear. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. As Richard was escorted away by the security officers, the crowd began to disperse, returning to their sightseeing and taking pictures of the Grand Palace once more. However, the energy had shifted. What had been a quiet, uneventful morning had suddenly turned into a moment that would be remembered by everyone who had witnessed it. Some of the tourists were still quietly talking among themselves, whispering about what had happened. A few had pulled out their phones, either to record the incident or to share their thoughts on social media. It wasn't long before the video of the confrontation, Richard's mockery and Daniel's calm yet firm response, began to spread across the internet. At first, it was just a short clip. Someone had filmed the moment when Richard tried to poke fun at Daniel, only to be met with a powerful warning from the royal guardsman. The video was shaky, but clear enough to capture Richard's embarrassed retreat. Someone had shared it on Twitter, adding a simple caption, "Respect the guard." Within minutes, the video was shared by hundreds of people. The internet reacted quickly, and people from all over the world were chiming in. Some expressed admiration for Daniel's composure and professionalism, while others criticized Richard for his rude and disrespectful behavior. But one thing was certain: Daniel had become a hero in the eyes of many. The video went viral. As it spread, hashtags like #RespectTheGuard, #StandYourGround, and #RoyalGuard clapback began trending. People from all walks of life, especially those who had been victims of disrespect or racism, felt empowered by the way Daniel had handled the situation. They shared the video with their friends and families, tagging it with messages of support for the royal guardsmen. News outlets quickly picked up on the story. By the time the video had been viewed by millions of people, Daniel was no longer just a royal guardsman. He had become a symbol of dignity and self-respect. Stories about the incident began appearing in newspapers and online articles. Comment sections were flooded with messages of praise, with many applauding Daniel's strength and restraint. Even those who hadn't been at Buckingham Palace that day felt moved by the video. Some commented, "This is the kind of leadership we need in the world," while others shared their own experiences of dealing with disrespect and how Daniel's actions had given them courage. In the days that followed, Daniel was contacted by a variety of media outlets, from local news stations to international television networks. People wanted to know more about him, his background, his career, and what had gone through his mind during the confrontation. But Daniel remained humble, not seeking the attention that had suddenly come his way. He gave a few interviews, but in each one, he focused on the bigger picture, that respect should be given to all, no matter their background or job, and that standing up against cruelty or disrespect, even in small ways, could make a big difference. Back at Buckingham Palace, things returned to normal. But for those who had watched the video, the incident would remain unforgettable. They had witnessed not just a guardsman doing his duty, but a man who stood for something much bigger. The idea that respect for one another is essential, and that sometimes silence and dignity can speak louder than words. The world had seen it, and many had been inspired. Days passed after the viral video of Daniel's confrontation with the disrespectful tourist. The world had already spoken, and the story had become more than just a small moment at Buckingham Palace. It had become a symbol of dignity, respect, and standing up for what was right. Back at the palace, life returned to its usual rhythm. Daniel continued his duties, standing guard outside Buckingham Palace as he had done for years. The hustle and bustle of tourists, the flashes of cameras, and the occasional shot of excitement were all familiar to him. But now something was different. The world knew his face, his calmness, and the way he had handled the situation with quiet strength. He had become an unexpected hero, admired by people across the globe. But it wasn't just the tourists who noticed Daniel's newfound recognition. His commanding officer, a stern and experienced leader who had seen countless guardsmen come and go, called Daniel into his office one afternoon. The man had always appreciated Daniel's work ethic, but today it was different. There was something in his expression, a mixture of pride and respect, as he motioned for Daniel to sit. "Sergeant Okafor," the officer began, his tone calm, but with a hint of admiration. "I've seen the video, and I've read the reports. What you did out there, it wasn't just about standing your ground. You showed restraint. You showed professionalism. You reminded the world what it means to respect one another, no matter the situation." Daniel sat still, unsure of what to say. He had always known his role. His duty was to protect, to stand firm, and to remain silent in the face of provocation. But now he realized that what he had done had made a bigger impact than he had imagined. It wasn't about personal recognition. It was about something much more significant. The officer continued, "You handled that situation perfectly. You didn't let the words of a disrespectful tourist get under your skin. And in doing so, you taught those who watched what true strength looks like. I've received messages from all over, supporters, fellow officers, and even members of the public, all of them praising your composure." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He had simply acted the way he had been trained, the way he had always acted, calm, firm, and unshaken. But he could see now that it wasn't just about doing his job. It was about being a role model, not just for those around him, but for anyone who saw the video. The officer leaned forward, a small smile crossing his face. "I want to make it clear, Sergeant, that you've earned more than just the respect of the public. You've earned the respect of the Royal Guard, and I'm proud to have you on this team. Your actions remind us all that our duty is about more than just standing still. It's about standing for what's right." Daniel nodded quietly, humbled by the recognition, but still focused on his role. He didn't want to be treated differently, didn't want the attention. He just wanted to do his job. But deep down, he felt a sense of pride, not just for himself, but for the message that had spread across the world. That respect, for others, for oneself, was something that everyone should carry with them. The officer finished with a final remark. "Keep up the good work, Sergeant. You've set an example for us all." Daniel left the office feeling the weight of the recognition, but also a sense of peace. He had done his job, and he had done it well. But more importantly, he had shown the world that respect can be powerful, and it always triumphs over hatred. The days following the incident at Buckingham Palace continued to unfold, but the ripple effects of what had happened didn't fade. While Richard had returned to his life, trying to shake off the embarrassment, the world had moved on to something far more important, the lesson of respect. Daniel's composure and strength had become a symbol to many, one that reached far beyond the walls of the palace and the busy streets of London. For Daniel, life had mostly returned to its regular routine. He continued to serve as a royal guardsman, standing tall in front of Buckingham Palace as he always had. The tourists still came in droves to take photos with the iconic guards, and the crowds continued to marvel at the grandeur of the palace. But now, there was a deeper respect in the air. People looked at Daniel differently, not just as a guardsman, but as someone who had taught the world an important lesson. Daniel's story spread across the world, but not in the way many expected. He wasn't featured in headlines or plastered on magazine covers. Instead, people spoke about him in quiet admiration. His message had resonated deeply, that standing up for respect doesn't require aggression, but strength and dignity. One morning, as Daniel stood guard at his post, he noticed a family approaching. A mother, father, and 2 young children, who looked excited but nervous as they took in the sights around them. The mother walked up to Daniel with a warm smile. She paused for a moment, as if unsure how to speak to the royal guardsman, but then she simply said, "My children saw the video of you the other day. They wanted to thank you for showing the world how to stand up for what's right." Daniel's heart warmed as he looked at the children, who were smiling shyly. The little girl, no older than 7, whispered, "You were brave. We think you're cool." Daniel smiled gently, grateful for their words but also humble. "I was just doing my job," he said, his voice calm as always. "But thank you." The family took a photo with Daniel before moving on to explore the rest of the palace grounds. But as they walked away, Daniel could see the little girl looking back at him, a newfound sense of respect in her eyes. In that moment, he realized that he had become part of something bigger than himself. The power of his actions had gone beyond just a moment in time. It was affecting those who needed to hear it the most. Meanwhile, Richard had tried to move on from the incident. He had taken the walk of shame from Buckingham Palace that day, and while he had initially denied the impact of his words, the reality had slowly sunk in. His actions had consequences. The viral video had followed him, and he had faced uncomfortable questions from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Though the backlash had stung, Richard began to reflect on what had happened. He realized that his words had been harmful, not just to Daniel, but to the larger community. The respect that Daniel had shown, even in the face of insult, had taught him a valuable lesson. Richard had begun to understand that true strength didn't come from belittling others, but from lifting them up. Months passed, and the story slowly faded from the headlines. But for those who had witnessed the events unfold, it remained unforgettable. Daniel's quiet strength had reminded everyone of the importance of respect, not just for those in uniform, but for all people. And as for Daniel, he continued to stand guard, doing his job with the same dignity and poise he always had. But now, in his heart, he carried something even more precious: the knowledge that a single moment, a single act of strength, could change the way the world viewed respect forever.